With everything going on in the world right now, it's very easy to forget that other things are happening. So while we're all focusing on Omicron and Brexit and other things like that, there are tensions happening on the eastern side of Europe. Specifically, the news are reporting that Russia has built up its army, around about 100,000 personnel, just across the border from Ukraine. So this is, of course, ratcheting up tensions and concerns that Russia may well yet again cross the border into Ukraine and annex some territory. So what has been going on in the meantime, for those who perhaps not been following the news, and admittedly I haven't until recently, is that there have been some intense negotiations. And what has happened is Russia has submitted, or Russian diplomats have submitted, a couple of treaty proposals to NATO. Now, those treaty proposals contain things like Russia demanding the right to veto any other new members to NATO. Now, that sort of thing is patent nonsense. There is no way an organisation like NATO would ever allow an external country the right to make decisions on NATO matters. But I thought I'd be interested in focusing on this point and what that actually means from a negotiation perspective. So let's rewind a little bit. Let's assume here that Russian intent isn't to actually invade Ukraine. So those 100,000 troops there are there as a negotiation tactic. They're there to apply pressure. And Putin wants to apply pressure on Ukraine, wants to apply pressure on NATO and on Europe to meet his demands. Now, there are various demands that Russia has. They don't want NATO expansion. They don't want European and NATO influence to grow in Ukraine. And there's probably a whole host of other things as well. And I wouldn't even rule out a little bit of a play of, the continuing of the discussion, the tensions around gas supplies, for example. There's quite a few things going on here that could all be in this negotiation mix. So now Putin is not afraid to throw his weight around to make threats and to imply that he will do certain things. Sometimes he carries them out, sometimes he doesn't, and that unpredictability is also a part of the strategy. So what we see is definitely a pattern of applying pressure. We've seen this for many years, and we're seeing this in the current scenario. So when the Russian diplomats submitted the treaties to NATO for consideration, this would outwardly meant to be a demonstration of their desire to negotiate a solution. Yet when you make demands that are so patently unreasonable, they could not possibly form any viable negotiation, then you have to realize that negotiations are a little bit different from what they appear. That is not what is actually being negotiated. So the treaties are there to distract attention for media purposes, propaganda purposes. The actual negotiations will be elsewhere on other matters. So they can be about the ability of NATO and Europe to influence Ukraine. And that will be contained in other agreements with other institutions and other countries. But I think that the Russians are just applying leverage. They're applying a message that they can cause trouble and let the NATO and European nations back off. That is essentially the message. And it doesn't require a negotiated outcome. It's just a threat, a counteraction or perceived action. What can the NATO do in response? Well, they can escalate. So you could put lots and lots of troops and weaponry on the border, for example, in Poland or other countries around Ukraine, are able to cross the border at short notice if required. That's one way of trying to counter Russian threat, but that is an escalation, and there's a definite unwillingness of NATO and European states to do that. But the other way is also to go economic. And this has been more the US counter strategy. It's pretty much to apply to Russia that if they do take that sort of action, that severe economic sanctions will hit. And so this is where we come to the issue of things like gas, because of course the Russians have been using gas as an economic weapon to enhance their negotiation position. But that's a two-way sword, because by refusing to supply European nations, that also means they don't get paid. And right now Russia has severe economic pressures of its own, and those can be increased, and the COVID outbreaks going around the world is not going to improve the situation. So does it mean that Putin is going to invade Ukraine? I don't know. But what I do know is that his troops being there are all part of the strategy to distract, to deflect, to divide. And that's very much while the NATO countries argue amongst themselves on how best to respond, because Putin is a little bit more the single point of authority in Russia, he will be more able to counter-respond quickly. And that's deliberately a strategy, is to show that he is able to outmaneuver Western countries, so that improve his support domestically, especially during difficult economic times, and possibly even obtain some concessions, even if discreet ones. So, for example, no further weapons into Ukraine, no further encroachment, no further development of the Ukrainian democratic institutions, for example. Will that be codified in any kind of agreement? Possibly not. This may be what you might call a bit of an under-the-table type of deal. And at which point the Russians may then start to pull those troops back from the border, thus de-escalating the situation. So very much what I've seen reported is what I think are the fake negotiations, the stuff that's there to deflect attention, to distract. And what will be going on behind the scenes is more how Russia likes to operate, the sort of things they'd like to agree with the US, with the EU and Germany and whoever, to apply pressure on countries like Ukraine. Because sometimes the pressure can't be applied directly. And this is one thing you have to remember about negotiations, that Russia trying to apply leverage on Ukraine may force a negative reaction back from the Ukrainian leadership. They may just say, no, we hate your guts, we're not interested, go away. But by applying the pressure to Ukrainian neighbours, they themselves may force the concessions from the Ukrainian leadership, or act in a way that forces Ukrainian leadership to back down from certain policies or strategies that they had intended, for example, more EU or NATO integration. So that's the game. That's what I am seeing the strategy for the Russians. And so this is why I always emphasize when anyone who's going into a negotiation is that you don't focus too specifically at the beginning on the negotiation itself, on the agreement. You always ask yourself the fundamental question: what is the objective? What are the things that are trying to be achieved here? Because sometimes a negotiated or an agreed outcome is not actually the objective. The negotiations are just there to apply pressure. They're not actually going to achieve the outcomes sought by one or both sides. And that, I think, is very much the case here in Russia. Russia doesn't want a negotiated outcome. Russia just wants people to back down, to de-escalate on its terms. So that's my reading of the situation. Welcome anyone with more knowledge than me, which there'll be plenty, I'm sure, who may wish to comment and provide any further insights.